Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm Michener from Murder by the Book, coming at you with one of my favorite things, our afternoon virtual events with authors in the UK. So obviously, there's a little bit of a time difference, and so we like to do these in the afternoon so that they're not having to be on at midnight. So today is very exciting. We're going to be joined by Flynn Barry and Abigail Dean. Flynn Barry's new book, Northern Spy, was actually a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, and Girl A has been getting raves everywhere. We highly recommend both. I've been a Flynn Barry fan since Under the Harrow, and I'm so excited to talk with her today. I'm going to mention a few things that are coming up while you get your live notifications and join in here with the chat. So April 24th is Independent Bookstore Day. We actually have a day full of cool things. We have a promotion that you can get a free Murder by the Book poison mug with $100 purchase when you come in. We also have the limited edition Independent Bookstore Day tote bags that are $10, and I'm going to drop a link in the comments to those because they're already available. And we're going to have a lot of the cool swag. We're going to have the Baby Yoda onesies, the I Love Independent Bookstore Blackwing pencils, which I'm very excited about, and the limited edition signed Nigella Lawson cookbooks, amongst other things. So those will be available on April 24th, on that Saturday, specifically for Independent Bookstore Day. And then we'll also be coming at you with a really unique event. We're going to be hosting, in partnership with Mystery Writers of America, all of the people nominated for the Best Novel Edgar Award. So it's going to be authors all over the world. That's also going to be one of our 1 o'clock events, and we'll be interviewing them. I'm really looking forward to it. So while I have been doing my little introduction, I've also been stretching it out a little to kill time because it's perfect. Flynn Barry has just joined us. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do introductions. I'm going to start with her, even though I just saw her pop in on the screen. So she's trial by fire here, coming in hot. So let's see. There is Flynn Barry. Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks for having me. Just a little technical difficulties over here.
That's great. I've never been happier to see someone pop in the studio. I'm Michener. It's nice to meet you. We normally do this ahead of time. I'm a big fan of yours, and I'm excited to hear you and Abigail talk about Northern Spy today. A lot of people watching know who you are, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce you formally. So Flynn Barry is a graduate of the Michener Center for Writers and the recipient of a Yaddo Fellowship. Her first novel, Under the Harrow, won the 2017 Edgar Award for Best First Novel and was named a Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post and the Atlantic. And as I said, she's here today to discuss Northern Spy, which was a Reese Witherspoon pick. Congratulations on that. I can't wait to hear this conversation. We're also joined by Abigail Dean. Yay, we're all here. So Abigail Dean works as a lawyer for Google, and before that was a bookseller. She lives in London and is working on her second novel. And as I mentioned earlier, her recent hit was Girl A, which I'm big fans of both these books. So I'm gonna actually go away now, let the two of you chat, and sit back and enjoy this. Y'all have fun.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Flynn. It's great to be talking to you. I loved this book. I was so gripped by it, and I was kind of gripped, but also kind of incredibly moved. So I'm so excited to be chatting to you today. How are you doing? I mean, I know kind of publication must have been a crazy few weeks. How are you?
I know, I feel like this could turn into just like a therapy session between you. I'm good. It's just chaos. I have a 2.5-year-old and a 7-month-old at home, and my 2-year-old is homesick from daycare today. So it's just chaos all the time. But it's been exciting. I think I was nervous about having a book come out during the pandemic and what that would be like, and if it would feel somehow muted. And it's been so wonderful and joyful to be able to meet readers still because of Reese's Book Club and how kind of big and exuberant a community that is.
Yeah, I feel it's a time when social media like really comes into its own to get to see the number of people who must be reading Northern Spy right now.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. What about you? How's your publication whirlwind been?
Yeah, it's been strange in the UK. We're still slightly under lockdown. So this week was the first week I saw Girl A in an actual bookstore. So I sort of had a bit of a build up before that. But I think in similarity with you, still seeing people reading the book on Twitter and on Instagram has been absolutely amazing. So Northern Spy, I mean, are you, I know this is sort of one of those questions that as a writer you might have answered a few times over the last week, but can you tell me and tell the audience about how you would describe it in your own words?
Yes, so Northern Spy is a psychological thriller. It's about two sisters, Tessa and Marion, and their involvement with the new IRA in Belfast. And it's about sisterhood and new motherhood and spies and informing and about the conflict in Northern Ireland. Tessa's a new mother. She has a 6-month-old baby, and she's also a producer at the BBC in Belfast. And she's trying to sort of balance her ordinary life against a backdrop of increasing threat levels.
Which gives the book like such incredible tension. I read in a big kind of UK publication this week called Prima. One of the journalists has said about your writing and about your books, there is something remarkable about an author who can create a completely different book each time they write. And kind of thinking about that, I was wondering, is that something that you sort of set out to do intentionally? Is that something you think about when you're thinking about a new idea, or do each of your ideas just kind of come to you in sort of independently of that intention?
Yeah, I'm so glad that she said that, because I think that is always the fear, that you're not trying anything new. But with the ideas, they just sort of took on their own structure and shape based on the story and the characters. So with Under the Harrow, it's very much about two sisters and one woman's sort of quest. And so the structure felt very kind of tight and tense, and depended on that. And then with the second book, there's a little bit more sort of room to move around, I guess. So that took it on a different structure. And I think it's just hoping that the idea will give the story shape and give it bones. And I don't outline or plan in advance. And I sort of write these really long, sprawling first drafts and then cut them down to size and rework and start over from the beginning. And then it seems like letting the character sort of take the lead is how I get the structure. And there's this quote that I love that I think about all the time. I think E.L. Doctorow said about how writing a novel is like driving at night and you can only see as far as your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way, which is, I think, the best writing advice.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I'm always quite envious of the people who have quite extensive spreadsheets and stuff, because I just don't think sometimes the characters surprise you as you go along, I think. Were there any, talking about them? I'm sorry, Flynn.
I'm just spreadsheets and the outlines and the people who sort of start with the first sentence and end with the last sentence of the book. It just seems so efficient. And then I'm also jealous of screenwriters. I feel like having all those pin boards or, having index cards with each scene must be so satisfying, instead of just sitting down with a blank piece of paper and hoping for the best.
Yeah, and driving into the night.
Yeah.
Yeah. Were there any particular kind of characters or particular sort of scenes almost of Northern Spy that came to you first, or was it the plot as kind of in a more fully formed sense?
Yeah. So one of the earliest scenes was a scene where Tessa, the main character, is up in the middle of the night. She's just nursed her baby and gotten him back down to bed, and she sees flashlights in the field behind her house. And at the time that I started that scene, I didn't know who was holding the flashlights or what was happening with it. But I really like that idea of a woman being alone in a house with her baby and not really knowing what was outside. And I think in particular, waking up in the middle of the night with my own boys, there's something that feels kind of almost dangerous about it. Like you're not supposed to be awake then, and anything could happen in a weird way, which seemed fitting for the atmosphere of the book that I was working on as well. That she's already kind of vulnerable because of having this tiny baby, and then and being sleep deprived and a little bit on edge because of that. And then there's also the sort of threat of the outside world.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that, because I feel those like deep nighttime hours are generally not a time that you see unless you're kind of, maybe sort of out and you're young and you're surrounded by people in a city. But I guess motherhood does give you that insight into those really strange times which nobody does expect to necessarily see.
Yeah. And how something in your body knows that you shouldn't be awake then, I think. And so there's this odd kind of uncanniness about being awake that much in the night, I think.
Yeah, I remember that scene very, very well from the book as well, and it's kind of incredibly unsettling in lots of ways, and one of many actually really gripping moments. You mentioned there Tessa's kind of vulnerability, and I'd love to hear kind of more about your relationship with her, and and sort of how she came about, because she does feel very vulnerable at times, but she's also got, to me, kind of a real a ruthlessness almost in her protection of her son, and in her approach to her job as well.
Yeah, so she works as a producer at the BBC, and I interviewed a producer at the BBC and actually had her read a draft of the manuscript and give me notes, which was hugely satisfying, like having my character actually reading the book in a way. And I really enjoyed writing someone who loves her job and who finds her job really stimulating and really engaging. And at the same time is trying to figure out how to sort of be two people at once. Because when she's with her baby, she has to be kind of soft and tender and slow. And then her job is very fast paced, and producing political radio shows for the BBC is intense, and it's high stakes, and it's sort of a high wire act. And I wanted to write about someone who is leading that kind of double life already of being a working mother. And then she already feels like she's sort of at capacity when she has a kind of a draw into the conflict with the IRA. And it was just sort of fun to look at a lot of my sort of feelings about work and motherhood, but in a completely different lens to my own experience. So I think all fiction is autobiographical in a way, but never probably in the ways that you might guess if you were reading it. But a lot of her sort of frustrations or joys are also ones that I've experienced in daily life and wanted to capture in writing. And it's funny, I feel like once you've spent so much time with a character, it's hard to leave them. Like I was wondering with Lex, if you had a hard time leaving her after Girl A, because they do become sort of your companion, or like you're in Philip Pullman, he has, in The Golden Compass, every character has an animal sort of companion, and it's almost like your characters are that. They're this person you're in constant dialogue with while you're writing. What was that like for you with Lex?
Yeah, I definitely felt like a sort of almost like a kind of claustrophobic closeness, I think, at times with her. And I think some of it is becoming very, very invested in a particular character's voice. I actually find it as a reader sometimes as well. And I found it with Northern Spy that you almost, particular books that I've been really involved in, I almost start narrating the world around me, or sort of thinking kind of in that character's voice, if there's a really kind of distinct element to it. And I definitely felt that with Lex, that sometimes I think I sort of, almost the flip side of something being autobiographical, that I actually started to sort of think about my life in her voice in a very, very unusual way. I don't know if that rings any bells.
Yeah, I did the same with your book. I remember walking around my neighborhood when I was in the middle of reading Girl A and thinking, that all of the houses seemed really menacing. You know, like I wanted to look inside every house and sort of check to make sure everyone's okay, because girl, it got under my skin so much. Or I was reading Asking for It by Louise O'Neill, which is a wonderful.
Oh yes.
And I started noticing teenagers everywhere. You know, I think the protagonist is maybe 16, and suddenly I felt like I had become 16 again. So I totally get that too. It's so odd how that happens.
Yeah, it is quite uncanny. And did Tessa's voice come to you kind of fully formed? Because I think it is so distinct. There's a sort of to me reading it, there is a sort of like I guess detachment in some ways, but also she has these moments of kind of like absolute tenderness in relation to her family. And I was wondering if that sort of voice was there from the very beginning, or if that was something you felt you kind of had to refine as you went on.
Yeah, so her voice came pretty naturally. I think with characters, often when I start writing, I don't know the particulars of their lives. So with Tessa, you know, she lived in a different town when I started the book. She actually had a different job when I first started it, and her family structure was slightly different. But something about their interiority or their inner landscape feels consistent from every draft. So it felt like I knew how she would look at the world even before I knew exactly who she was. And I really enjoy having that sort of slightly different lens for looking at the world as well. And it's with her, then I think the big sort of change in voice was as I learned more and more about Northern Ireland and the accent, I put in some of those phrases. And that was something that I was really nervous about before I started the book, because I know, I was talking about this with an author from Northern Ireland, that people in Northern Ireland make so much fun of actors who try to do Northern Irish accents and Belfast accents, and they just can't get them right. And I was really worried that I wouldn't be able to capture it on the page, because you watch a movie where Brad Pitt is playing an IRA man, and something in your head is going like, that's not quite right, is it? It's just not there. So I spent a lot of time trying to sort of get the actual dialogue right as well, and the dialect.
Yeah, those, I can see it in the phrases with some friends who are from Northern Ireland, and there were definitely some kind of moments of just those small colloquialisms that you definitely they felt very, very genuine for Tessa and for Marianne. Did you? I think that the setting, both in, I guess you've got the setting of Belfast, where Tessa works. And you've also got the setting of Grey Abbey, where she lives, this kind of amazing kind of coastal village. And I was wondering, were those places that you kind of know well? Because they felt really, really vivid. I mean, I feel like I can see the beach at Grey Abbey, for example.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of my favorite parts about writing is you get to spend time in a landscape that you want to spend time in, and to choose it feels like this wonderful kind of gift that you get to live alongside your normal life in somewhere completely different. And Belfast, I spent time in Belfast, and then Grey Abbey, I actually just visited sort of on a whim while I was there for research, because I saw the name at a bus stop in Belfast and thought it was such a gorgeous and evocative name for a town. And so I went to visit just based on the name, and it's one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen in my life. It's this really small village, and it's on a sort of spit of land between Strangford Lough, which is this huge saltwater lake, and the sea on the other side. And it has that kind of extraordinary light that you have when you're near so much water. And then also like farms and fields and really lush trees and flowers. And it just seemed like such a nice setting, particularly to use as a contrast with the violence of the conflict. And I think one of the things I found the most fascinating about the Troubles when I was researching it was that people were living in what looked like an idyllic pastoral landscape, but they were also living in a war zone. And that's such an odd kind of situation to find yourself in.
Yeah, because I think in that setting, there seems to be, there's like some fear as well, I guess, in the isolation. as well as it being kind of tranquility. I think there were moments in the novel when I was sort of particularly frightened for Tessa and Flynn, because they seem so removed from help and from other people in a way.
Yeah, I do think there's something a little spooky about not having neighbors. Maybe it's because I've never lived in real countryside, but the idea that you are kind of spaced out along a street does seem like it's a little eerie, maybe.
Yeah. I loved the setting. I thought it was incredible. Was there a lot of research involved in sort of other aspects of the book? So in terms of one thing that really struck me was there's elements of espionage in it. So I guess there's these really little intricate details that somebody might spend a certain amount of money on a debit card to indicate whether or not they want to hold a meeting the next day. And I found that stuff kind of really engrossing. And I was wondering, was that did you manage to speak to any spies as well as any producers? Because it felt really very, very kind of true to life.
Yeah, that was so much fun to research the tradecraft of spying. And I feel like I could have kept researching this book all my life. I could have happily kept researching it for ages and ages. And one of the reasons was because I find that so fascinating about how agents are trained and how handlers sort of run their agents. It was just so interesting. And that detail about the debit card was based on a story I heard about how a spy agency would give its agents Starbucks gift cards, and then when they use them, they could check the balance and know that they needed a meeting, because you can't maybe send a text or a call without someone watching. So I love that aspect of the tradecraft. And the way I researched it was a few different ways. One was there's been a kind of extraordinary subgenre of books from the Troubles written by former informers, where they talk about what it was like to be informing on the IRA and to be meeting with a handler from MI5. And they go into the specifics of sort of where they would meet and what would be talked about at each meeting. And it's extraordinary to me that wrote these books, because they are putting their lives at risk by doing so, right? They're admitting to being what would be one of the biggest targets for the IRA. So I've read those, and then I got pretty obsessed with MI5. I actually, on its website, you can fill out an application, and I did that to sort of see what they ask for. Haven't gotten a call back yet. Didn't actually submit it because I think it's illegal. You have to be a British citizen, but pretty far into that. And one thing I found really interesting about MI5 that didn't make it in the book was how they try to present themselves as like a great environment for the working mother. They talk about how you can like do the school run and then go do your work, and you don't have to work after hours because you can't bring your work home because it's secret. And just things like that I just found so fascinating about how it's being run now, because at the moment there's a huge MI5 base in Northern Ireland at the moment. There are hundreds of MI5 agents in Northern Ireland still. And one journalist I talked to said that it's basically a training ground, and that MI5 agents go to Northern Ireland to learn the tradecraft and skills that they'll use to fight terrorism abroad as well. Just so odd. It's just a really fascinating sort of shadowy underworld.
Yeah, I feel like that is something you could have just researched forever without actually ever starting writing. So I'm going to have to ask you, what was on the application?
Really interesting. I mean, I think they're looking at your ability to communicate and to remember information and sort of synthesize it. And of course, and they're looking to fill all these roles, right? Which is also, I want someone to write a book about this, about all the support staff. So you have, like physical therapists or cooks who work at MI5. So yeah, it was really fun. And that's what it felt like with this book. Everything I learned or read opened another sort of rabbit hole that I could have kept going down. Like everything was kind of a cascade. And especially with the history of the IRA, because you would see one figure in one book who would recur in another book, and then you would read about that person in an informer's book and see a completely different angle. And it just felt like this really huge sort of spider web.
Yeah, one of the things that kind of struck me, and I think you just kind of used the terminology in talking about your research, was, the idea of having kind of handlers, and the language around kind of MI5's involvement in the Troubles, and your people ultimately kind of sacrificing a huge amount to become informants. It feels very very kind of detached and inhuman in a sort of very strange way. And did you find that you developed kind of ideas around that? Because I think something kind of the times Tessa in the book definitely seems to question, the sort of morals behind asking people to do very, very difficult tasks in a political kind of manner.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about that, because I think this is one of those aspects of the Troubles that will keep being explored as we go forward, and that there are still so many stories to be told about what happened. Because at one point, there was an estimate that about 1 in 4 IRA members was actually informing for the British state. And a lot of people have said that the British government was sort of controlling all the sides, that they were sort of controlling all the chess pieces in the conflict, because they had agents in both camps of paramilitaries. And they've been accused of actually prolonging the conflict, because they were keeping things going in a way by having their agents keep performing operations. And one thing that's really extraordinary was that in order to be an informer, obviously you had to seem genuine. And so you had to carry out operations. And sometimes those operations were bombings, and sometimes they were murders. And the government knew about that and was allowing it to go on, which just kind of, goes against all ideas of moral decency. But at the same time, you can understand how, from MI5's point of view or the government's point of view, if their goal is to save the most civilian lives possible and to end the conflict, then they could sort of justify using any means necessary, even though as normal people, you sort of find that completely impossible to understand how the government had a hand in a lot of murders in the Troubles, as like through their.
Yeah, I guess it's very, very kind of disturbing, the sort of moral compromises that informants were required to make is, and yeah, I think almost kind of unimaginable. But I think that in Northern Spy, you definitely kind of capture that side in those questions. And yeah, to me, they were some of the most sort of like, yeah, disturbing and kind of intriguing parts to imagine yourself in that kind of situation.
Yeah.
I guess sort of one of the things another kind of thing that really struck me about the novel was the sister relationship, and it's something that I'm obviously kind of really interested in kind of my writing. So I found Tessa and Marianne's relationship so interesting. I think at first it seems like it's actually something, that they're very close, and but then as the novel goes on, there's such complexity to their relationship, and I wondered how you sort of went about developing that, if it was based on your experiences, or if there was a really there was a fictional relationship that developed.
Yeah. So my mom is one of 4 sisters, and I've always watched their relationships and sort of both admired and been fascinated by how they love one another and how they take care of each other and protect each other, and also how they have gone in such different directions as adults. So I think the sisterhood relationship to me is really interesting, because Tessa and Marion have the same upbringing, and they have the same parents, and they sort of have the same start in life. And so it's kind of fun to play with what a person can choose for her future, right? And to see what maybe your own life would be if you had made the choices your sister had made. And then it's also, it felt sort of like the whole book was often kind of like a love letter to the women that I had interviewed and who I had met. And I wanted to capture the relationships that they had with their own sisters and their own mothers, and the kind of warmth and the tenderness that they had in those relationships as well.
And so with these people, I'm guessing you mentioned the BBC producer. So were there quite a few other interviews that you kind of conducted that those that kind of added to that relationship between Tessa and Marianne?
Yeah, it was so much fun being in Belfast and interviewing people. I was just constantly blown away by how open people were with me. And I don't know if that's because, like, famously Irish people are wonderful conversationalists, and they're good at telling stories, which was a cliche that turned out to be true. I also brought a bottle of champagne to every interview as a kind of thank you gift.
It's a great tactic.
Actually, spending a lot on expensive champagne might have been the best decision I've ever made in my career. I think that, I mean, each of the interviews was extraordinary. One was with a journalist and political activist named Maria Cahill, who grew up in Republican West Belfast. Her family has sort of ties with Republicanism, and she was the first victim to accuse an IRA member of rape, and she did so at huge personal risk to her own safety, and became ostracized by a lot of her community. And I found her she's a dear friend now, and she's definitely an inspiration for the book, in that she and the other women I interviewed, there's also a security journalist named Alison Morris, were just completely tough, and they just refused to be bullied by these men who had controlled so many aspects of life in their community for so long. They would kind of laugh off the death threats that they got. Both of them, I know one had to have a panic button installed in her house. One had a steel bulletproof door installed, and they just got on with their lives. And I find that really inspiring. And they also, I lost my train of thought. Allison was the one who had told me about how for one assignment, she was blindfolded and put in a car. She was going to meet with a paramilitary leader, and she was driven all the way around the city and kind of like back ways to try to sort of disorient her so she wouldn't be able to say where the meeting had taken place. And then she sat down, and the IRA leader said, like, "Oh, would you like a cup of green tea?" And she was like, "What?" And it's just that contrast between, like, how ordinary life still comes in to the conflict. I found really interesting that, she was like chatting with this IRA man about the benefits of herbal tea and wellness right before an interview. Yeah.
Like, the ordinary hospitality almost makes the kind of violence even more, I don't know, even more sort of misplaced and terrifying in a really weird way. It reminds you that people are human, I guess.
Yeah, it's just bizarre. It's bizarre because there's that sort of humanity comes through constantly. And I think that's why it's good for fiction, because the IRA in particular, I feel like everyone can sort of understand their goal, which is to end colonialism and to unite the island of Ireland and to have a socialist republic or a democratic republic. And that seems really sort of morally noble and reasonable. But then the means to go about achieving it are so messy, and they're so violent and cruel. And so you have people with maybe the best of intentions, and then see what happens when humans are actually involved in a rebellion.
Yeah, it's in terms of the woman that you interviewed, that you're kind of now really kind of close with. I think that her being kind of ostracized from her community, it's really interesting seeing elements of that, I think, in Tessa's character, because she's had kind of a pretty deprived upbringing in some ways. She's sort of really fought to leave that behind. In certain elements, and in certain ways, she feels like a real kind of fondness for her childhood and the whole landscape that in Belfast. Was that kind of interesting to explore? That idea that has she done the right thing by kind of trying to leave her childhood behind?
Yeah. I was really interested in class in Belfast in particular because, especially during the worst of the Troubles, it was very much a class divided city, and you would have the worst of the violence happening in West Belfast and East Belfast, which are the poorer areas, and then South Belfast, which is wealthy, would be fairly safe even at the height of the conflict. And that idea that if you had enough money you would sort of be okay probably was one that I wanted to explore in the book, and how certain communities sort of paid the price for the government not maybe creating a more stable environment. And you see that now. So the past week there have been riots in Belfast, and those are happening in the same areas, right? Like they're happening in West Belfast and in areas where you have sort of working class Catholic and Protestant communities living side by side. And some of those people rioting are children. They're as young as 12 and 13, and they're being encouraged probably by older men from paramilitary organizations. And you can see how if you were a child growing up in one of those communities, maybe all the benefits of peace that you were promised during the Good Friday Agreement just haven't really come to your community or to your life. And so I can see how you might feel quite angry about that.
Yeah, I think that empathy is so strong throughout Northern Spy. I definitely found that there are kind of characters in the book, without kind of giving much away, that have committed terrible acts, but I think that you do an amazing job of kind of making them all human and all understandable, even if they're not sympathetic. And I think that's kind of that sort of was like another kind of thing that I loved about it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because it does seem like everyone in the conflict thinks that they're the good guys, and everyone thinks they're on the right side and the moral side, whether they're the police or the security service or the IRA or the loyalist militaries or militias. Everyone thinks that they're protecting their families and that they're trying to build a better world for their children or for the next generation. I don't think you find many people who went into the conflict thinking that they had sort of no regard for human life. It seems like most of the people thought that they were going to do terrible things, but that in a war there were casualties and it would be for a better future, which is also really heartbreaking. There's a woman named Dolores Price, who was an active member of the IRA, who said that for what it had achieved, she wouldn't have missed a hot breakfast. Like she wouldn't have done anything that she had done for what actually happened. And she had spent years in prison. She had almost died on hunger strike. And so you can see how hard it would be to sort of justify what you had done if maybe it hadn't achieved what you had hoped.
Yeah, massively so. I wanted to turn to make sure I kind of have time for one of the real defining relationships in Northern Spy, which is between Tessa and her son, Flynn, who I think throughout the course of the book is, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe like 6 months to a year old, I think. That bond is so kind of fantastically drawn, and I feel like Flynn is like, he's very, very small, but he's actually just this like wonderful character who sort of lights up the pages and the sections that he's in, and was depicting kind of motherhood and the joy and the difficulties. Was that a sort of real focus for you when writing this?
Yeah. So the boy Finn is definitely inspired by my older son, because he was 6 months old when I was writing the scenes where Finn is 6 months old, and a year old when I was writing the scenes when Finn is a year old. And it was just I don't think I set out to do it, but it just felt really natural that the bits of my life involved in caring for my son would sort of come into the book as well. And it felt really satisfying to sort of have a place to put, my kind of questions about motherhood and the, tedium of like sterilizing bottle parts or something, and to use it as material for my work. And I feel really nostalgic about writing the book in some ways because often I would write it while he was napping on my lap. He would fall asleep on my lap and I would hold him and write. And that's just one of like the best sort of practices I've ever had in my life. It felt really lovely to be connected to him and also working. And I think it's just, I found it important to write about motherhood because I think often we're kind of told subtly that motherhood isn't interesting. It's not a subject for serious fiction. It's not something like a war or politics or something that deserves attention. And you see how women who write fiction about families are often described as kind of writing like quiet domestic stories, and that they're kind of not validated in the way that male writers are often. And I found motherhood hugely important and hugely significant and wanted to write about it.
I definitely, I can definitely see that. And I feel like Tessa has such kind of ferocity, a feeling about Finn and about kind of protecting him. And I think that emotion is kind of as passionate as any kind of, male anger, for example. Like, it really, really is.
Yeah, and that seemed accurate in that I feel like I've heard that when you're pregnant, your amygdala, which is the part of your brain that controls fear, actually grows and that never shrinks back down. So there's a part of you that's constantly vigilant and constantly sort of scanning for threat and thinking of how you would protect your child. So she does have that kind of ferocity. I'm glad that you used that word.
It sounds like as well, I think there's sometimes a cliche that, kind of motherhood can set you back creatively and not necessarily be kind of like a sort of really like fruitful time for writing. But I'm sort of really like heartened to hear that for you, actually, it sounds like that was absolutely not the case, and it provided some amazing kind of inspiration and opportunities to write as well.
Yeah, Anne Enright, the writer, has written about that, about how when she had her kid, she was sort of waiting for the moment when she would become stupid because she had been told so often that she just wouldn't be able to think properly afterwards. And she's obviously writing it in her wonderful, kind of wry, cynical voice. But yeah, I mean, there's the idea that's so famous and so often quoted about the greatest enemy of art being the pram in the hall. And I think that's just another way we tell women to stop talking about themselves or that they're not that interesting. And I mean, I think writing is hard no matter what. Like it's hard if you have children. It's also really hard if you're working a full-time job. There's never, I think, like a life that's really built for sitting down and making up a story that no one's necessarily going to read. And so I just feel sort of awed by every book that I read and the sort of tremendous effort that has to go into the person actually just sitting down and doing it. Like for you, I mean, I can't believe that you wrote Girl A while you were working full time. What was your routine?
It was, I had a kind of luxurious beginning to writing it because I took some time off between jobs. Like I left a corporate law firm and I was I needed time off. I was in a pretty kind of awful place, to be honest. So I sort of had this like wonderful 3-month period when I just got to write, and it was then after that I kind of started a new job. But I found that once I was so invested, I'd kind of spent a decade not writing and ignoring this sort of like lifelong dream, really. And so I think that I wanted it enough by then to find the time in the evenings and in the weekends. And I think I let go of those notions of being this kind of like writer who was going to sit at a desk in silence for great swathes of time with no disturbance, and actually just kind of got on with it and wrote on my phone and kind of got it done in a way that, I mean, I feel like almost every writer I've spoken to or know of has ultimately had to do, because kind of life does go on, I guess.
Yeah. Did you ever work during your lunch breaks or during between meetings? Or what was it? I remember reading the author Marisha Pessl talks about how she had a job, I think as a consultant, and she would have spreadsheets open, but she would be writing her novel in the spreadsheets, like very sneakily. I love so much.
In quiet moments, if there was nothing else on, then yeah, I would. Especially remember kind of editing felt like it was very manageable to do in that time, because just getting through another 5 or 6 pages felt like an achievement at that stage. So yeah, I think it was just making the most of those snippets of time, which I think is something that, yeah, is not always appealing, but does kind of get the job done.
Yeah. I think that is something you realize, that you don't necessarily need to have 3 hours in order to get something done. And that novels are so great because you can always push it along in some way, right? Like you can read a page of research or write one line and then feel like you've sort of done something. Just so satisfying. I don't know how like poets do it, because that seems harder to feel like you can work on when you're not at your best.
Yeah, harder to dip in and out. I agree. I'm gonna have to bring up Reese Witherspoon again, Flynn, just because that must have been such a cool announcement, and I kind of want the behind the scenes insight. How did you find out, and I hope you had a lot of champagne. I hope there was some left from the interviews for you to celebrate with.
Yeah, it was completely insane. I mean, I still just can't. I really can't believe it. I don't know how to describe how little I can believe it. And we found out, my editor called me in January to tell me, and we both sort of shouted on the phone for a while. And then you can't tell anyone because they do the announcement when the book is published. And so I had to just sort of sit on this incredible news. I told my toddler. He didn't really get it at all, I don't think. I know. There's
Come on.
completely and I told my husband, but other than that, I just had to wait. And then the really fun part was the way the Reese's Book Club announces their book now is that they have an app, and all the readers sign on for a party. And I started crying because you're watching this live chat, and people are saying like, hi from Belgium, hi from South Africa, hi from France, hi from Indiana. And people are coming in from all over the world. And it's just this really beautiful and warm and enthusiastic community of readers who are just this like force for good. It's just magical. And I think I tend to be kind of cynical about social media and sort of what being online can be like. And this is just the most like generous and kind community. So it's just extraordinary. And then the app got a little glitchy, and so people started sending pictures of their dogs from their phones, which was also just bizarrely like the perfect way to celebrate for me, was seeing all these people's dogs on their phone. It was great. It was really great.
I'm so glad that so many more people are going to get to meet Tessa and Marianne and Finn and this amazing book. And I think we've got some questions as well from the audience.
We do have some questions. I think people have been kind of quiet and just enjoying the talk. I have, but we do have some questions. So this one's long. It's going to block Abigail for just a second. So both Northern Spy and Girl A have a lot to say about family, specifically sibling relationships. What were both of your inspirations for creating those dynamics and making them true to life?
So I'd love to hear from Abigail first, because I love the sibling relationships.
And actually, I'm gonna interrupt, and it's always such a nice thing when people come on as guest interviewers. So I definitely want Abigail to have a chance to talk a little bit about Girl A just briefly, and then we'll address this question if that's good with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. I think it's always that thing where you're so interested in hearing about another writer's book and experience. But no, Girl A was out in February. It is the story of Lex Gracie, who is the Girl A of the title, the girl who escaped. So as a child, Lex manages to break free from her parents' religious cult and frees her 6 brothers and sisters and exposes her parents' crimes that have been taking place there. And Girl A really deals with how those siblings have survived 15 years later. By that time, Lex is a successful attorney. She's living in New York. She has no interest in revisiting the past. But when her mother dies in prison, she doesn't have a choice. She has to return to the UK and to her family, to her siblings, to decide the fate of the House of Horrors, the childhood home where they grew up. So yeah, I think in kind of real similarity to Tessa and Marianne's relationship in Northern Spy, the sibling relationships are kind of at the heart of the book. And I think, they're both kind of very caustic in some ways, and incredibly tender in other ways. And for me, I think that the inspiration was almost like looking in as an outsider. As an only child, I was always so interested in the sibling relationships I saw between my friends and their brothers and sisters. That really delicate balance of kind of love and resentment in some ways, and that desire to defend somebody to the death, even if you're actually very irritated by them at the same time. I just found such interesting motivation. Yeah, Flynn, I'd love to hear more about Marianne and Tessa's kind of origins and their relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly, I don't have sisters, and it's looking in on it from the outside and wondering about it. And Girl A, I mean, for anyone who hasn't read it yet, Girl A is so much fun because each sibling is sort of introduced one by one. And so it's this mystery of you're so excited to see which sibling comes next and to learn about them. And I love that structure so much.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question specifically for you, Flynn. Were you ever scared for yourself while in Belfast?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, Belfast is like hugely safe. It's actually a very safe city, and even at the height of the Troubles, you still had tourists coming in to visit throughout the 70s and 80s. So I didn't feel scared for a practical level, but on an emotional level, I think whenever you're writing something, you have this sort of fear that it will blur into your own real world, that your fictional landscape, whatever you're creating, you're sort of conjuring something up that will then come into your own reality. And I'm curious also about Girl A, if that felt that way, if ever looking at that much darkness felt like it was coming into your own world.
To a degree, I think I had to almost set a kind of curfew of writing for myself after a while, because I found that in the daytime, as is often the case, you kind of, your fears don't necessarily come to light. But I did find that I would kind of wake up in the night, in those strange hours that we kind of started off discussing, when you don't feel like you should be awake. And that was when I sort of thought about the Gracie family a lot, and about kind of their parents and what had driven them to become so isolated. And yeah, it was one of those strange things where I think sometimes that's good for writing, to dwell on those fears and to think about them. But I think it very easily becomes kind of quite an obsession, and maybe not something to think about late at night anymore if you want to sleep.
Yeah. So one specifically for Abigail, what inspired you to write Girl A?
The sort of sibling relationships was definitely a big one. So even when I was a kid, I was fascinated by the brother and sister relationships in big families in books. So like, whether it was like the Weasley family in Harry Potter or the Marches, I just loved the kind of complexity of a big family, and all the different little histories that are there, and what they look like, both in childhood but then how they kind of end up converted into adulthood in different ways. I think it was that, combined with true crime, with a real interest in in true crime and in the idea that so often that the podcasts and the TV shows that we watch are very focused on particular events, sort of maybe the mystery at the heart of something, but very rarely like what happens afterwards, in this sort of endless time after for people who've been involved. So yeah, the sort of months and years for people who've kind of almost been defined by something that happened to them. I was really interested in how that would affect different people in different ways. And I think that's why each of the siblings has such a different reaction and response in life after the house.
All right. We have a question here. Do you think about where Tessa would be now, what she'd be doing, and how her relationship with her son has evolved, or have you had to let her go?
Yeah, it's funny. I think there's always some level of grief when you finish a book. And so it has been hard to let go of the world of the story and also of Tessa and her son and her sister. In my mind, I do, but I also feel like I like how readers invent what happens after the page as well. So I don't want to ruin it by saying what I envision them doing. And I do also like to think about sort of the women in each of my books getting together sometime and talking about what they've been through. They all have had a pretty rough ride. And I feel like they'd have a lot to talk about.
That's great. Well, I had a question that I was going to ask and it just flew out of my brain. I'll remember it in a second. So completely gone. Okay. Who is your favorite character in Northern Spy?
Oh my gosh. I'm actually really sort of delighted by a few of the minor characters. One is the makeup artist at the BBC. And that was because when I visited and was spending time in the building, I met the makeup artist, on whom this is not based, but she told me something that I love, which is that the people in the building call it the wee confessional, because everyone who comes in before going on the evening news is nervous. They have stage fright, even though they're usually, like really major politicians or actresses or people who are used to that kind of extreme, exposure. But then they're with her and they're alone, and they're maybe people who aren't often alone. They usually would have handlers around them or even like protection. And she's doing their makeup, she's touching their hair, and they just tell her all their secrets. And I really love that. I think someone should do a TV show or a book about a makeup artist, if anyone's interested.
Yeah. I'm probably, to a lesser extent, hairdressers as well. I mean, you go in and you just tell them everything that's happening in your life, and then 6 weeks later you repeat it. Okay, I know what I was going to ask. So both of you, clearly you must be working on something else. Do you want to talk about it, or what you're working on now, or is it hush hush? Abigail, your bio says you're working on your second book.
What a curse! Why did I add that? No, I am working on a novel about conspiracy theories. So it's the story of an attack that takes place, and one character loses a loved one in that attack, and another character believes that the whole thing was a hoax, and that it never took place. And it follows those two characters in the aftermath and then in the years that follow, as they get kind of closer to conflict or to redemption. So yeah, that there is a first draft of that is happening.
Yay, great. Okay. How about you, Flynn?
Yeah, I'm working on a new book as well. It's set in New England, but it's still early days, so I'm not talking about much more. But I don't know if you have time. I would love to hear, Abigail, has it been, what's it been like writing after Girl A?
It's, I've sort of, I definitely struggled at times over the last year. And I think some of that was also being in lockdown. It felt like there was a lot of time, but it was very strange time. It felt sort of sludge-like and kind of really difficult to work in at times. But I'm at a stage now where I just about feel comfortable sort of talking about the plot, and I feel sort of, it took a while to fall in love with the characters, because I think I'd been so obsessed with the Gracie family and for such a long time in a way. But I think I'm getting there now, and that feels nice. So tough, but with some resolution as well.
Great. The question I always like to end on is about reading, because I don't know, it always seems to make people happy. So what books did you read in your formative years, and was there a book that made you want to be a writer? Let's start with you, Flynn.
Yeah, it's so funny. I feel like whenever I'm asked about books, I only think about what I'm reading right now. And right now I'm reading a book called Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson, which is so good. And so it feels like the only thing I've ever read in my entire life at the moment. I think Maggie O'Farrell's wrote a book. She wrote a book called After You Gone that I read when I was 12 or 13. And it's a really beautifully written, really suspenseful, psychological book about a young woman. I remember being completely blown away by it. And I think maybe that would be the most influential in terms of what I was hoping to accomplish in writing, and how sort of absorbing her work is, and immersive and unsettling also. So yeah, I think Maggie O'Farrell would be my sort of desert island writer.
Excellent.
I love that book. It's fantastic. And I read it as a teenager as well. I think my mum was reading it, and I managed to like steal it from her. And it's so beautiful and so gripping.
How about, is that your pick, or do you have another?
My book, in terms of the book that made me kind of want to be a writer, I think was probably a book called The Insult by Rupert Thompson. It was one of the sort of first adult novels that I read, as a kind of relatively young teenager. And it's this kind of beautiful, like intriguing novel about a man who is shot and left blind, who starts to believe that he can see. So it has so many things that I think influenced me as a writer, in terms, it has an amazing opening. It has a real kind of unreliable narrator who you feel great affection for. And I was just remember being so blown away with it when I read it.
So the reason I asked that question is everyone who answers that question thinks back, and when they do, they smile, and it makes the crinkles in their eyes, like a genuine smile, thinking about that book. And I always love to end on that, because everyone's happy and reminiscent. So thank you again both for joining us this afternoon. Congratulations on Northern Spy. Abigail, congratulations on Girl A. I can't wait to read your next books. Thanks to those of you who are watching for the questions. And we will be back tomorrow at 1 for another UK event with, it's perfect for Sherlockians. We have Bonnie McBurden and Leslie Klinger joining us. So that'll be tomorrow at 1, and lots other in the pipeline. So check our calendar for more. Both of you have a wonderful evening, and thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.